this afternoon, we have an engaging lineup of speakers and panels. And right now, it's just me between those inspiring speakers and you. But before we delve into those, I want to highlight the impact your presence here today is making. A portion of today's proceeds will support the Colombia TPF Global Resilience Fund, which is a pioneer collaboration between Turkish philanthropy funds, Columbia Global Center in Istanbul, and Columbia University. And our aim is to redefine our approach to global crisis response. And that's the reason these three institutions came together. This morning, Elmira, in her opening, mentioned TPF's entrepreneurial culture and how we operate just like a startup. So every initiative and decision is made by that culture, and is impacted by that culture. And this mindset also empowers us to create dynamic collaboration, just like the one we are doing with Columbia University. And our goal there is to combine our local expertise and our partner NGOs on the ground with Columbia's vast entrepreneurial and intellectual resources. Last year, right after the devastating twin earthquakes in Turkey, TPF established a fund. As Mehmet Kırdar, our co-chair this morning, also mentioned, the fund raised over $20 million and has supported and continues to support critical programs around education, providing safe spaces for children, providing psychosocial support, and investing in economic development. And this Columbia TPF Resilience Fund is a step further to that. And our goal is to enhance the resilience of affected communities so they can better withstand future challenges in their communities. Our aim is to fund programs developed by Columbia's world-known faculty with our NGO partners on the ground so we can build more resilient communities. By being here today, you've already made a contribution to that fund, so thank you. But please consider deepening your support for this initiative. Columbia University has already committed $1 million, and our aim at TPF is to match that $1 million, and that's only possible with your generosity. So if you're interested in contributing or want to learn more, please ask or speak with one of TPF team or board members today. And we have someone from Columbia University as well here. Yeah, right there. So you can talk to her as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce one of our board members, Ülkü Rowe, as the moderator of the last panel of the day. Ülkü is a distinguished leader in the tech industry, currently serving as the Technical Director of Financial Services at Google. She has been at the forefront of developing cutting-edge solutions that leverage data and technology to solve complex problems in the world. Ülkü is also a passionate advocate for equality, known for her work in championing equal pay for women and increasing female representation in technology. She has inspired many by actively mentoring emerging leaders and using her influential voice to promote fairness in the tech industry. So please join me in welcoming Ülkü Rowe and all of our esteemed panelists, John, Jeff, Tammy, and Ayşe.
Good afternoon. On February 6, 2023, a massive earthquake shook the core of our nation, our homeland, Turkey. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Countless number of lives lost, cities ruined, and millions left to deal with the aftermath that they're still dealing with today. The days that followed were filled with a profound sense of loss and grief, But it was also an incredible display of unity and solidarity. We stood together. Organizations like TPF have brought communities together and provided immediate relief. The tragedy tested our resilience, but it also highlighted how important it is to be prepared for disasters and how important it is to have effective disaster relief. And today, we're going to explore just that. How can we harness the power of technology and innovation in safeguarding our communities and to enhance our resiliency against disasters of all kinds? Today, I have a very distinguished panel with me. I'd like to welcome them. John Cömertoğlu, my fellow Googler. John is the head of product for Google Maps Crisis Response. Tammy Glazer from Microsoft AI for Good Lab. She's a senior applied data scientist. Ayşe Hortaçsu, director of projects at the AppliedTechnology Council. And Jeff Schlegelmilch, research scholar, director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, Columbia Climate School, Columbia University. Let's give them all a round of applause. All right, John, let's start with you. So you're the head of product for Google Maps Crisis Response. You focus on assisting people as they recover from a crisis or during the crisis as well. You spearheaded a lot of initiatives at Google Maps. You led actually the COVID-19 response as well as the Turkey earthquake response. So tell us about what is Google Maps doing in terms of disasters, in earthquakes and beyond, and what do you do in your role?
So thank you for the intro. And I really appreciate being here and get a chance to talk about the stuff that we're doing at Google Maps. Really, the work that we're trying to do is climate change means a lot of natural disasters are happening more and more frequently and with higher severity. So that's really, we started our journey really early on with Katrina. It predates me by a decade. But around 2020, when I joined the team, it was a nascent effort because Australia was seeing the largest bushfires in its history. The whole continent was burning, and we had to do something. And one of the things that brought me to Google, after spending about 15 years in tech in other places, really just building products to make money, really, was to go to a place where I can have impact, or where we can have impact with technology. And Google Maps is a super natural way of doing that, because one of the key insights was when there is something wrong in the world, whether that's a natural disaster like an earthquake, whether that's a human-made conflict, whether it's I remember the big explosion in Lebanon, one of the largest explosions we've ever had. People turn to Google, and they turn to Google and they look for stuff. They look for information. They look to see where it was, what happened, when did it happen. But then we've noticed something that people actually, especially in Google Maps, they need the map to recover, to react. And it was a profound insight that prompted us to go from just telling people something has happened, right? Like detecting an earthquake is extremely important. But it really fueled us to start thinking about what can we do more? And it really turned into a whole portfolio of products. And I only work on a handful of them. It's a very large group of people at Google who are working on these kind of products. And it ranges from early detection, even prediction. I was very proud to see in Nature, only about 2 weeks ago, a Google researcher published a paper where we can now detect or predict, actually, floods in 80 countries around the world up to 7 days before they happen. That 7-day prediction is an incredibly valuable tool for communities to know about some devastating event like a flood, so you can be resilient against it, right? You can leave, you can protect the community, or you can take proactive action. We also do things like hurricane tracking. We do earthquake detection. We try to do an early alerting product with earthquakes as well, using sensors built into phones. And then we do a lot of as you said, a post-crisis response. And there is where I see the value of community a lot, and I see the value of Google Maps a lot, and technology. Our role is to be an amplifier, right? Like, so Google Maps has over, I think, 1.5 billion people accessing it to figure out where things are and how they can get there. So how we use that for good is really at a time of a crisis, mapping it is the first thing that we do. It takes a lot of effort. We have partnerships with authorities globally to be able to map them. But we also have partnerships with NGOs on the ground. So like İhtiyaç Haritası is a big one in Turkey that we look to work with. And there are many, many others around the world. After a crisis, how can we bring that helpful resources in? In Turkey, earthquake, for instance, it was the Sahra Hastanesi and Sahra Eczaneleri. That was a big deal that we were able to get 6,000 of them mapped. And over 50,000 people used them to find the help and resources they need. So I'm excited about the space. I'm excited to talk more about it.
Well, so am I. You know, when you're talking about all the work that you're doing, the question in my mind is how? How is he getting this data? Where? Do you have a team in Turkey? Are they people that are working on doing this? But we're going to come back to that, so hold your questions just like me. I'm going to come to Tammy. Tammy, you're a senior data scientist with Microsoft AI for Good Lab. Now, you use computer vision and predictive analysis to measure disaster risk, and you respond to humanitarian crises, and your team has actually been involved with the earthquake in Turkey. So I'm excited to hear about your team in general, but maybe a little about the work that your team did in the Turkish earthquake.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and for the thoughtful question. So I'm an applied data scientist, and a lot of the work that I do is using geospatial and satellite imagery for a variety of different humanitarian and climate applications. Our lab, the Microsoft AI for Good Lab, is a philanthropy within Microsoft of about 50 people. We're spread across 4 continents. We have many different projects in different areas, ranging from humanitarian disaster response applications, but also sustainability and looking at cyber influence operations, looking at population health. So it's a wide array of areas. Not everyone is working in this space. However, some of the great work that we're doing is around understanding flood risk, which we'll talk more about. One of the efforts that I'm leading in particular is around population mapping. So how can we use satellite imagery to understand over time where are populations moving and how are people responding to different climate events and how is that affecting migration patterns. And specifically to your question about the Turkey earthquakes and the work that we did, so our team was involved in the building damage assessments that happened immediately following the earthquakes. And so we had a partnership with Planet and Maxar, which are satellite image providers, who were able to provide high-resolution satellite imagery directly following the events. What we did on our team was we deployed what's called a satellite imagery annotation tool, and it's this open source tool that allowed everybody on the team to help with annotating the imagery immediately, whether they were technical or non-technical. So you can look at the image and say, does this area seem like it is a damaged building? Is it an undamaged building, or is it background? And just making these boxes and these little annotations was extremely helpful over the course of a few hours. We then had a model that we had already trained as a general purpose building damage model that we could fine tune on this specific Turkish imagery that we had, and then we were able to run the model over the entire affected area. And with that, we were able to see what areas were we estimate to be damaged or undamaged. And as a final step to that, we overlaid that with the Microsoft Building Footprint data set and with population data to understand approximately how many people we thought were affected based on what we were seeing, and specifically create a map of buildings that had been damaged. And so that was shared directly back to the Turkish government, and we had a close partnership, and we'll talk more about this, but the feedback that we received on that was really, really helpful, and that helps future damage assessment work that we're doing. So that's one example of the types of projects that our team takes on.
Now, this is a great example, I think, of how technology can be useful and helpful in an environment where the damage is so big that no human effort can actually reach the level of technology and to be able to do it very quickly with technology resources, because that's an inspiration that technology can be used for good. Thanks, Tammy.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, I think what made this, there are many damage assessments out there, but I think what made this effort unique was the turnaround time within which we were able to do it, as well as the resolution of the imagery that we were working with, which just really set this apart from other applications of our damage assessment work.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask Ayşe next. With every participant, I'm getting more excited about the rest of this panel. Ayşe, you lead the projects at AppliedTechnology Council. You are a structural engineer, and more specifically, you're an earthquake engineer. You've led many projects, you've received a lot of rewards, and some of your work actually is influenced seismic policy in the US and globally. So tell us about the work that the Applied Technology Council is doing, and after the earthquake, how have things changed for you?
Of course, thank you. And again, thank you for inviting me to be here today. I guess I'll start with the personal side first. I mean, this earthquake is personal to everyone in this room, right? A lot of us have family in Turkey and they were affected by the earthquake. I was actually an engineering student. I was an undeclared junior, as they call it, Stanford, and the 1999 earthquake happened in Turkey. And I was looking towards engineering, didn't know what to do with my life, but that earthquake said to me, okay, here's the point. Like, this is where I'm going to direct my career towards so that I can help my country in the future and then hopefully other countries to avoid disasters like this. I wasn't fast enough to be successful at that, but we continue working. So again, that's kind of why I've dedicated my life to working at a nonprofit organization rather than working at a design firm, which is what a typical structural engineering career would go. We are an organization that was formed by practicing structural engineers who realized that there was a big gap between what the researchers are studying and learning at universities and what they're able to use in their engineering offices. Because the engineers have to be efficient, they have to be cheap, they have to work with architects to be able to make their designs come true, and the research results they're sometimes too abstract, they're too hard to use, they require the use of computing that is not available to practicing engineers. So we are an organization that is specifically dedicated to bridging technology transfer. And what we've also taken this to is we take the research and put it into practice, and we influence a lot of the building codes that are used in the US right now, specifically in the earthquake area, but we also work with wind and other hazards. And also in the last 10 years or so, we've been able to take a lot of this knowledge and also infuse it into policy. So I live in San Francisco, and I'm really proud to report that a project that we started working with the city of San Francisco back in 2000 just resulted, the count as of a couple months ago, that resulted in 50,000 people having safer homes in the city of San Francisco. And this is because we did a lot of work with the data. That's something we talked about earlier. You can't do anything without data. So we collected all the data about the types of buildings in San Francisco. We identified what are their vulnerabilities and prioritized what should be retrofitted first. And with that, we were able to identify these apartment buildings that have renters in them that don't have another place to go, should be the first types of buildings that should be strengthened. And this was required of all of the building owners. And so 5,000 buildings, so 95% of this building type is now in compliance. So it's really, really rewarding to see the work going, all the way from really complicated numerical simulations at the university all the way to implementation to my neighbor's home. And on the Turkey earthquake side, I was deployed to the field within a week by the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, and we used a lot of the satellite before and after images that were provided by Microsoft and Google, because it's exactly what we used when we got to towns. We said, okay, we need to see where the ground motion station is, we need to see where are the damages so that we can learn, because our job is to collect perishable data after earthquakes, because after the demolitions, there isn't much for us to learn because we cannot test a building this size on a shake table, so we have to see it in the field.
Yeah, thank you, Ayşe. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit in more depth, but I think this collaboration is a theme that comes keeps coming. Even in our prep session, a few weeks ago, some of the panelists started collaborating already on some projects, which was really inspiring to see. And talking about collaboration, Jeff, you also sit at the Center of Collaboration. Now, you're the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. You're making our societies more resilient. But you're not just an academician. You are also advising many in the private sector as well as the public sector, and you're influencing policy. And you have literally written the book on disaster preparedness. You have authored 2 books on the topic. Please tell us about the work that you're doing, both with the center and more broadly.
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and really excited for the conversations on this panel. So I guess, to sort of frame kind of what we do, our center is based at this intersection of research, policy, and practice. And so in some cases, we're generating original research, but in all cases, we're trying to apply it to have practical outcomes. And a lot of times, the field of disaster science is very young. The evidence base is spotty, and so a lot of times we're taking some pieces where there's a lot of evidence, other pieces where it's circumstantial, and others where we're just trying to figure out sort of what is the most responsible way ahead and move that forward. But it's also inherently intersectional. There's an equation we use. I know it's right after lunch, and here's some academic throwing a math problem at you, but bear with me. The equation that's often used to describe risk is the hazard times the vulnerability divided by the capacity to cope. And so a lot of times, when we think of what branches of science have to come together for that, if we're talking about the hazard, we need to know, is it geology, is it seismology, is it how tectonic plates are moving together, is it moisture evaporation in the atmosphere? When we're talking about vulnerability in the built environment, right, what type of shaking, how much shaking, what's the wind speeds that this power line can handle? And when we talk about capacity to cope, there's a social, a political aspect to that. Who has the resources to move? Which apartments should be prioritized. You have the flood warning 7 days out. Who has the capacity to leave, right? And so then all that has to sort of come together towards a very three-dimensional, very dynamic sort of response environment. And what it does is it sort of gives us the ingredients for understanding disasters, but the same disaster can play out very differently within a community and across different communities. So a lot of our work is really at that translation point, at sort of translating what is the research telling us and what does that actually apply to. And so some of it, as I mentioned, is through traditional research projects, other it is through implementation, through working with communities in more of an advisory role. It's always sort of this question of where, as a university, should we begin and end, but where can we provide expertise that also respects the expertise of the community in terms of how this information can be best integrated into the response. And very briefly, I'll mention I did spend some time a couple of months ago in Hatay surveying some of the earthquake damage and working with some local partners there. And one thing we chronically do not do well, and no one does well, is long-term recovery. And so it's very encouraging to see everyone here today to be more than a year after the earthquake and still have people willing to pay attention to it, willing to support efforts, willing to have these conversations. This is a very rare thing and a very important thing because this is the trajectory that ultimately sets people's lives on that path to recovery or not. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Jeff. And you have pointed out a very important aspect of disaster recovery, like how do we make it sustainable? And I think, as we look forward, it's important for us to continue having that conversation. So let's start the conversation. As we look into the future, you all come from very innovative, in some ways from technology, from a nonprofit world, from the academia world. As you look into the future, what excites you the most? What technologies or what innovative approaches to disaster preparedness and also disaster response, both in the short term and on the long-term sustainability of it? Who would like to start?
I'll go.
Take us, cool.
So we'll start, and then I'm curious what you guys have. But some of the things that's really exciting are the basics, right? So computing power. is very interesting for doing things at scale, getting satellite imagery. I think we work with very similar, Airbus is another one provider that we work with. It's remarkable. I've been in Google Maps for about 5 years, but it still feels like Star Wars stuff to be able to get near real-time satellite data and to be able to run these stuff. So that's pretty exciting. But what's more exciting to me is there's finally an acceptance of climate change, and finally an acceptance of the bringing together of, it's not just government's job, it's not just academia's job, but it's everyone's job to really prepare people. And that is new. Like, it's even new in the last 2-3 years, I feel like, where Google has a seat with academia, and we all have a seat with governments, because I think finally there's a realization that we don't have to be at odds with each other. It doesn't have to be all about regulation and sort of this weird enemy. But if we could work together, you asked where the data comes from. The data mostly comes from authorities and governments and people. And that is a pretty new experience for me in the last 2 years. And I'm pretty excited to see where that leads us, especially when we do things like flood predictions. I think you guys are working on that too. And even when we're doing long-term response, which, as Jeff was saying, is not a strong suit at all.
Following up on that, an area that really excites me is similarly this convergence of fields that separately or in the past didn't work together. So specifically thinking about geophysical modeling and climate science and bringing that together with machine learning. Typically those communities operate entirely separately, but only now are we seeing them coming together for, especially within the space of disaster preparedness and response. And so, for instance, machine learning models are very, very good at bringing in huge data sets, all of this wealth of available data. However, they're not typically that good at generalizing to areas that they have not seen or specific kinds of scenarios they haven't seen. Whereas if you think about geophysical models, they're very good at generalizing, but they can't bring in all of the data that is available. And I'm really excited about, as we begin to bring these together, which I know is happening at Columbia. The LEAP program is one of the pioneers in this area of bringing these sectors together. That's very exciting for me.
I'm going to ask a question because this is like getting me excited, but you need data, and you need like real current data. A disaster like the one in Turkey or a typhoon or it happens, like how quickly do you see that data? Because one of the problems in like getting relief to the areas is you don't know what's happening on the ground. Like, do you get these satellite images like a minute after the earthquake happens? Does it come 3 days later? How long does it take to run your model? Like, how does this even work?
Do you want to take it first?
Sure.
I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. My experience, so typically the way this works is if something happens, so there are satellites taking daily imagery. However, if something happens and you need something quickly or more quickly than that, there will be satellites that are deployed specifically to that area to take imagery. But it's a several-hour delay, and in reality, because there's a lot of processing that happens of the imagery before it makes its way to us, it can be several days. And so, for instance, with the Turkey earthquakes, we were using imagery from the first 3 days after the earthquake, and this is considered very quick turnaround, but it's still not a matter of hours, and we want to get it to be a matter of hours. It's not there yet.
Yeah, and to just add a little bit, like one of the areas we work on is wildfires, and wildfires famously cause smoke. When you have smoke, turns out satellites can't take pictures. It's that kind of like, I'm not a scientist by any version of I shouldn't even be on this panel, I think. But as someone who's just fascinated by it, one of the things is you have to ask for it. Meaning the providers that we all work with, they have really expensive products. And one of the things the reason why Microsoft and Google are part of it is you need a lot of money to get access to those satellites. Not everyone can do that. The second thing is you have to ask for it. And then number 3 is, you have to have all your models ready. Otherwise, turnaround times can be days, weeks in some cases. So I think 5 years ago, we were nowhere close to doing this. I think this is all new. And as things get worse, we get better.
Yeah, and you both mentioned it. A lot of this is like knowing where to get the data and quickly getting the data. And Jeff, you talked about this before. It's all about collaboration, like to make sure the right people know who to talk to during a disaster. Is that something?
Yeah, I'd say too, I think one of the things that I guess, is exciting but also a long time coming is understanding what is the nature of these collaborations, and more importantly, the incentive structures of different groups starting to align more. So we're working with a lot of different financial firms and groups like that who are very interested in disasters, partially because they're taking tremendous losses as a result of it. The pandemic actually really accelerated, I think, a lot of that interest in things. We look at the different incentive structures here, and you're absolutely right. Like, the biggest bang for your buck is pre-disaster, and I've seen figures ranging from $1 saves 6 all the way to $1 saves 15. The challenge is that when we look in democratic governments, voters reward effective disaster response and they punish ineffective disaster response. There's no correlation between preparedness investments and not. So that incentive structure is a little misaligned. Similarly, I'm going to be careful saying this in a philanthropy event, but a lot of times, right, which is why it's so great we're having this conversation here, you get the massive donations as an emotional reaction to what you're seeing. It's very emotionally driven, and trying to plan 30 years out and time frames for that. It's no surprise that early entrants, I think, from the private sector are people who are underwriting investments for the next 30 years, 50 years. But I think that incentive structure can often keep us from making those essential commitments and investments ahead of time that can actually offset and mitigate against these tragedies down the road.
Yeah, absolutely true. I see everyone shaking hands. I feel like you all agree on this topic.
Yeah, one thing that is fascinating is because, so as you said, I started in 2020 in February in this role. So something happened in 2020 March that changed the world, and it was the same kind of thing. There was no preparedness, but one of the things that I've learned over the past 4 years is there's really good in people. So when something bad happens, and people know I'm from Turkey, it felt like almost all of Google wrote to. At least, I don't know about you, but it felt like that. It was an outpour of what can we do, and it's very good that it happens. It really does help.
Yep.
And there are people like World Central Kitchen is what I think of when it comes to like this incredible rapid response, and that's all good. But you're right. And one anecdote for me is part of the work that we do is air quality. Air quality is not directly related to any natural disaster except for fires. And as you said, though, in peacetime, when the weather is like this, I run the air quality layer in Google Maps. Our usage is low, just 1% less, like 0.1% of users. Then you have Canadian wildfires make New York weather unbreathable. I was a popular thing that day. Like, our usage shot up, I think, 1,000,000%. And it really just speaks to me to what you just said. No one knows what to do when air quality is bad. They genuinely don't know. But when it happens to them, they really start reacting to it. And it's actually really awesome that we get to talk about an earthquake. I mean, I'm sad that it happened, but the fact that we're talking about it a year after gives me hope that maybe this time, this is the catalyst, like the 1989 one, to start doing something about it. Because when a similar earthquake happened in Taiwan, the results are very different. So there is human element that we can change. Or when Japan gets a 7.4 earthquake with barely any loss, you start realizing, yeah, there's more we can do.
And talking about investments that we need to make for disasters that are impending on our society, climate change is probably top of that list. And Tammy, your lab is doing work on the climate change. Do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe like, what can we do? How can technology help with climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, especially thinking about investment, I think what's really helpful here is, like, I'm a huge proponent of the open source community and open sourcing models and data sets. And so, we've talked quite a bit about kind of the flood work and the earthquake work that we're doing, and we have a huge drive towards making all of these openly available, and also thinking about metadata standardization when it comes to even if this is all available, if somebody else wants to use it, often they can't use the work that we're doing. And so how can we standardize metadata in a way that is transferable between academia and the private sector? We have a group of people in our lab that are working more in sustainability and conservation. There's a number of different projects, and right now our focus is on how do we get those all to be shared and open source.
Yeah, and when you talk about climate change data, what data are we talking about?
So for us, part of it is the satellite imagery and what can we see, and that includes things outside of traditional optical imagery. So something I work with a lot is called synthetic aperture radar data, which is a type of data essentially that can cut through clouds. And so in these cases, you can actually get a sense of what's going on the ground when there are storms, when there are wildfires. It also provides a day and night supply of imagery, which is different than traditional optical imagery. So that is sort of one bucket of data. There's also historical weather data is extremely important, and so it's not always the same, it's not always imagery. Sometimes we're merging together these different types of data sources, and so often you have to kind of get creative about how you bring those things together, but those are the two main sources that I am usually working with.
If I may add something there, so I also work on the regulation side of things. So all of the buildings that are designed in the United States have to use hazard loading that comes from a certain standard. And the way it currently is, for example, flood loading is only based on floods that have occurred to date.
Explain to us what flood loading means.
So how much the flood levels can rise up the coastline,
I see.
and that is all dependent on how much they rose in the last 100 years. And it does not account for climate change. And we've been working, there's, even within structural engineering, there's a lot of people who want to change things, and there's some people who are saying, we don't want to change things, we like them the old way. So we had to form a new committee that is called future conditions, right? We're not allowed to use the word climate change, but we're trying really hard to infuse consideration of climate change into flood hazard loading, into building design. That will probably come through in 12 years from now in the United States. So again, technology, all of the work that's all providing the support that we need, but the regulation moves a little slower than desired.
Yeah. So I kind of see the pattern here. There's technology is happening, but then there's the collaboration that needs to bring it to fruition in a way that's it's doable, and there's policy work and influencing there that it all needs to come together. So I think collaboration is the one topic that keeps coming up in this discussion around how do we both get ready for disasters, and when they do happen, how do we address them? So let's talk about collaboration. How do we collaborate better?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. I guess I started verbalizing, so I probably have to give an answer.
Well, you can collaborate with your panelists.
Yeah, so I guess there are two pieces to this that I think are really important, is that, look, we build civil society, we build research, we compartment complex things, we reduce it down into essential components. You have a department of water, you have a department of transportation, but then you get flooding on roadways, and all of a sudden they have to work together, right? And so collaboration ends up you have to take two different groups that are well designed to have bureaucratic expertise or scientific expertise in certain areas, and suddenly have them speak the same language and work together. It's a hard thing. It's a very hard thing to do. And I'd say that part of it is putting in the work for doing it, and it's time consuming and it's expensive. I think pilot projects where you can demonstrate the capability are really exciting. Getting them to scale is a whole nother problem, because you have to find a way to sort of build it into the incentive structures of different organizations, different sectors of civil society. The other piece I would say, which is where we chronically fall short, is who are the first responders? And the first responders are always the most local. It's always neighbors helping neighbors. It's always community-based institutions. And so I think along these really exciting things with technology, and they're great and they should be used, what is the capacity to absorb and make decisions and actually alter outcomes in the early hours of a disaster? And that's where I see leveraging of technologies. So one of the things we saw with Syrian refugees in particular was this landmark shift, and actually was with some researchers and data in Turkey as well as in Jordan, where the smartphone became really important. The data plan became one of the first things people looked for when they came over the border. It wasn't food, wasn't shelter. It was a data plan, because this was their address. This was their connection to their community, to their relatives. This was the social cohesion, the social capital, maintaining those connections, which we can actually measure and know are some of the strongest predictors of how people do in the aftermath of a disaster. So there comes a point where innovation is sort of taken advantage of, and you usually have early adopters who really do cool things and do these products, and then they work their way into what are people in the community able to leverage this with and able to do with it. And I think that last mile of innovation and of collaboration needs to continue to focus on the most local of circumstances and the most local of use cases.
Yeah.
Do we have time to add on to that a little
Please.
bit? So something that you said really hit the right spot for me, because it's what I've seen, getting to do my job is a privilege. And I'm well humbled by it, because one of the things that I've learned, just like you said, for phones, and I think WhatsApp specifically was the thing that people needed because it was a way to communicate. One of the things that I learned is when you work in consumer tech, when you reach a certain number of people, it slowly becomes the truth. And that is extremely humbling to be at the forefront of it, but it becomes very interesting to then work with those different groups that you talked about, whether it's science or policy. One thing that I saw was there's a lot of scientists who I work on road flooding. That's a pretty big deal for Google Maps. And this year, we're going to have probably one of the most busy hurricane seasons. At least that's what it's looking like. And so do remember of me when you guys realize Google Maps does not work really that well when there's a hurricane, because scientists can predict where floods may be. Policy knows what evacuation routes they want to use and which ones are going to be open, but today they don't talk to each other. One thing that I found, though, is when Google Maps gets in the picture, they all start wanting to talk to us, because it is a novel, and I think media, New York Times is probably feeling the same thing. Media and consumer products have this power of, if we can just get those guys to talk and determine where the floods are going to be and which evacuation routes are going to be basically kept open, that becomes real. And I've never had that clarity up until I talked to FEMA, who for years told us exactly that. Oh, that's not our jurisdiction, that's a local sheriff, that's a county, you can't go there. But nowadays, they're reaching out to us, and Florida, actually, kind of surprisingly given the political climate of Florida and big tech, but Florida reaches out to us before crises, and they are telling us, that route is going to be open, can you make sure that's mapped accordingly in Google Maps? So there is something about media and consumer apps that really in the past 5 years, I think smartphones are the reason that made it sort of the center of collaboration. That's pretty exciting.
May I add one example from personal experience that was really humbling? I mean, all of the projects that we do are in close collaboration with subject matter experts, first responders, and there's a constant feedback loop. And I remember for a separate project, similar kind of a damage assessment work, we were working with first responders, and the immediate feedback we got is, we need to be able to print these maps. We don't need better accuracy in your models. It's good enough, even a little, we don't care how perfect it is. We just need to be able to physically print these maps out and bring them to the field, and that should be your entire focus right now. Whichever organization provides us with the assessment that we can print, we'll use. And getting that kind of feedback, I mean, sometimes you need even as a data scientist, you have to be low tech. You have to think about, especially where there's no connectivity, how can we deploy these solutions, because otherwise there's no use for them. And so I have constant conversations like this, and it's extremely important. We couldn't do our work without these conversations.
Okay, 2 questions. One, did you print the maps?
Yes, we figured out a way to get the maps printed, but it's not usually the first thing we're thinking about. It's usually about the fancy model in reality, and then you have to step back and really think about the 2 ends of the data pipeline. Where's the data coming from? Who does it represent? And then at the other end, how are we actually delivering a model? How's somebody using it on the ground? And to me, those 2 ends are arguably more important than what's happening in the middle often.
Yeah, I think it's a bit ironic that sometimes, technology moves at this lightning speed, but sometimes innovation comes from the more basic technologies. It's almost like you you have to go in all directions, use the basic and the most fundamental, and get maybe some of the most interesting players to talk to each other that you wouldn't necessarily think that they would be talking to each other. It's the first responders, it's the AI researchers, and it's the nonprofits and the academia that all have to work together to get this going. So while we're on this path, Shania talked about equity when she was introducing me. Equity also comes in disaster response. How do we ensure that, when we're responding to disasters, we do it equitably and we reach the populations that are most vulnerable and that have been most affected, and they don't always get the same level of response from the efforts? Jeff?
I would say to start, we don't. We consistently don't. And we can predict who's going to hurt more than others in a disaster and watch it play out. And this does come back down to, by very definition, disadvantaged communities have less access to the resources. And think about it, if you look at the side of a mountain, if it rains where the water's going to flow. And in the incentives of a disaster, it's about fast action, moving quickly, and so you work through pathways where it's a numbers game. It's a lot more work to reach people that are harder to reach. And we saw this in the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a great series of maps where you could see the overlay of highest mortality rates, and then you would see the overlay of vaccination rates, and it looked like a negative, a film negative. Sorry, is that too? A film negative is when they're, no, I'm just, right? It was the inverse of each other, right? And we have a lot of social vulnerability data, particularly in the U.S., but also elsewhere, where you can actually, sort of map out and very much predict. And it kind of comes down to they're two really important predictors, and they're very sensitive to talk about. One is social cohesion, how connected communities are to each other. And when there are policies that break apart that cohesion through histories of ethnic-related or other types of segregation and things like that, you could disrupt that social cohesion and disrupt those social bonds and that capacity to cope, denying economic activity, access to resources. And the other is political, vertical social capital, how connected you are to your politicians and how connected and how effective those politicians are at getting resources. Has a lot to do with how aid flows and how it gets in. And so I think that we're really good at measuring and predicting inequities in disaster, but I don't believe we have yet cracked the code in terms of how to actually force that extra attention, with some exceptions and some model groups. And I'll give just one quick example, is that in the U.S. in the later days of the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the vaccines were available and we were seeing large discrepancies between the African American communities, and there was proactive engagement to work with people in communities, to work with spokespeople, to engage in meaningful ways. And those numbers started to correct for a period of time. So I think it shows that it is possible, but it takes a model that has to be somewhat altered from the current priorities and incentives, which are all about speed.
Yeah. Ayşe, this is a topic dear to your heart, so please.
Yeah, it's again something I think, just like Jeff said, because there isn't a solution on the post-disaster side, that's something we're trying to attack on the pre-disaster side as well. So again, the building code, for example, puts a higher priority on senior living facilities. And when we are designing these retrofit programs, if possible, we would actually like to prioritize vulnerable communities because they don't have extra resources. And if they lose that rent-controlled apartment, that means they will have to leave the city that they were contributing into. So it's something we're trying to force on the pre-disaster side so that Jeff doesn't have to deal with it on the post-disaster side.
So I'll ask the two tech people on the panel, is the tech the equalizer, or does it add to the problem?
Well, I think I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. I think one area that technology is very helpful is bringing in data that we haven't had before on where do people live that are sort of those invisible communities that haven't been mapped. And often that is something happens and you're focusing on where are the connected communities, where do we know people live, but censuses happen infrequently, and there's a lot that happens between those years, and so we have this additional data we can use, and that is one really important way that technology can be helpful. I do think it's important that we have diverse perspectives in both technical leadership but also development, and bringing in those perspectives is hugely helpful, and until we can increase diversity in those spaces, there's still a lot of challenges.
Yeah, and I think, to add a little bit on that question about does it bring equality, it could. But I just said, Google Maps has 1.5 billion users. Great, but there's 8 billion of us, right? So I think one of the fascinating, humbling truths about big tech is the whole world could feel like 1.5 billion. That's my users, right? Or our users. But one of the things that I think Jeff was sitting on this earlier too, there's a vast majority of people who don't have access to electricity, to the internet. They have technical literacy or technology literacy is pretty limited in a lot of places. And turns out technology has the power to make the extremely connected be safer. So the people with multiple cars who can afford to find another house, those people are better informed than ever about crises. But it does leave the rest of the folks behind. And it can actually increase that disparity because it's so easy for us to say, oh, well, we mapped it on Google Maps. Well, if the person doesn't have a phone, that means nothing to them, right? So there is a very interesting thing we haven't solved yet on how do we go to the communities who are actually vulnerable but don't have access to the things that we claim will help them. And we haven't figured that out.
And I'll add to that, actually, as we talked about before, the deployment of technology has helped lower the barriers. So we've seen organizations sort of emerge in disaster response, community-based organizations serving the most vulnerable, who are able to gather support, donations through social media groups, communications through groups. As we mentioned, among Syrian refugees, the ability to communicate, and I should add, communicate securely with each other, given that the environment are all tools that, when it does become available en masse, lowers the barriers and are able to create mechanisms for reaching folks that were previously difficult to reach, albeit if they have the technology to begin with, of course, to your point.
And if there's anyone here who's looking for what can we do, one of the things that we know is solar power is getting cheaper and it's incredibly important for disaster recovery. So if anyone wants to build an NGO that could deploy solar plus batteries plus cell connectivity with cheap cell phones, which can be gotten at $25, $30 cell phones nowadays can run WhatsApp. That could really change people's lives. And we know when the Russia-Ukraine war started, people who were fleeing Ukraine, it landed in places like Moldova and Romania and their first question was cell access. And it was really, really difficult. Actually, one of the things that we've done is when there's a bad crisis, when there's a bad thing that happened in your area, Google Maps will now tell you to have offline maps because of the data access thing. And that's the kind of small stuff that you don't realize until you do it, how important it is. But really, if anyone wants to do something, solar plus connection plus cheap cell phones will save lives more than anything else, probably, more than food in most cases, because we're pretty good at the food distribution, not so good at data distribution.
I'd have to delete Angry Birds to be able to download the maps. That's a deal breaker for me, but I get the point.
Well, it is, after all, an innovation summit, so we're going to walk out of here with business ideas as well as inspiration. So I want to give you each a chance, and I think, John, you started this trend, to talk about, what is the one thing you would pick? If you were to say, okay, this is where we should invest. This is what we should do. This is the most important thing. It's a complicated problem. One thing is not going to solve the problem, but where is your heart? Where should we look at? What's most exciting?
I'll start because I think I just said mine. But it is really
get us going, John.
Ubiquitous access to energy, data, and sort of connectivity is, to me, the next big thing in the next 5 years. I'm not talking about the flying cars kind of future, but in very honest terms, getting more people access to technology and energy at scale has I don't know if it's 1 to 15. I don't know if it's 1 to $100. Like $1 spent. I don't know if it's going to get even more than that. But that's where I would put all my efforts in the next 5 to 10 years.
Tammy?
I think one area I've alluded to a few times, but is very much in open source and in creating these spaces where all these organizations doing these great things can actually share models, share data, share techniques, because often we're doing the same things over and over again in different contexts. There's definitely not enough information sharing, and so that's sort of where my heart is in really investing in the open source community.
And mine would be to take all of that information and visualize it, simplify it so that people know the risks they're taking every day, and if they don't like that risk, put some pressure on the decision makers to help them become more resilient.
And I would say think small and be boring. That oftentimes some of the most excruciatingly sort of difficult but most important things are getting into the communities, understanding the dynamics with the partners. I think we heard examples across all of us, but then from that will illuminate sort of these sociological fractal patterns that appear again and again and again in every disaster. And if we can come up with those ways of engaging communities and bringing these things that last mile, then it can really sort of proliferate.
I want to thank all of our panelists today for this very engaging conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. And thank you for having us today, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.